Hello YouTube! Today we're going to look at moralism. There are two moralist views worth considering. Moderate moralism, which holds that a moral defect is sometimes an aesthetic defect, and ethicism, which holds that a moral defect is always an aesthetic defect. Since moderate moralism is the weaker claim, we'll focus on that one first. Obviously the arguments for moderate moralism can be used to support ethicism, although they'd need to be supplemented with other considerations. First, there's what I'm calling the argument from artistic practice. This is just the point that if we take a look at how art has actually been practiced throughout human history, it's heavily bound up with moral concerns. There are artworks that are propaganda, that try to agitate people. Think of wartime art, or the socialist realist art of the Soviet Union. Many artworks try to challenge the status quo. Think of feminist novels, or anti-war songs. Consider the 1960s with the counterculture movement and all the music that was intertwined with the moral ideals of that movement. Further, we've often seen art being used as a tool of moral insight. We think that by engaging with plays or whatever, by reflecting on moral problems that may emerge in the narrative, we can develop a greater moral sensitivity. So there are many examples of art where it almost seems to miss the point to ignore ethics. If we consider the practice of art, we see that artists often have the goal of communicating some moral message. Now, there are two important difficulties with this argument. First, it rests on a hidden assumption which goes something like, if something is among the goals that artists have in creating art, then that thing is an object of aesthetic value. The idea is, we look at artistic practice and consider how art has actually been produced and the sort of goals artists might have in mind in producing art, and we see that a central goal is moral education or moral insight. The trouble is that this assumption is obviously wrong. Almost all artists have the goal of making money, but monetary considerations, economic considerations, have no bearing whatsoever on the aesthetic value of an artwork. In fact, for many artworks, the central goal of the creator might have been to make money. A band might release an album just because they're running out of money, so they've got to bang something out to get the cash rolling in. I think the Grateful Dead often saw themselves as being basically a live band, and they released albums just to get a bit more money on the side. But this has no influence on the aesthetic value of those albums. The second problem is that we can recognise moral insights or the moral perspective that an artwork might promote without accepting it in any sense. What's aesthetically relevant is how well the artwork communicates its message. It doesn't matter so much whether we agree or disagree with it. We can say, what this argument from artistic practice shows is that we have to consider the messages that artworks communicate. We can ask questions like, does it communicate its message effectively? But the argument doesn't entail that if we pass any moral judgments about these messages, these judgments have to influence our judgments of aesthetic value. So that's maybe not such a successful argument. A second argument, perhaps more powerful, comes from Carroll, who is the main exponent of moderate moralism. Carroll's argument begins with the point that artworks are always incomplete. When you read a novel or watch a film, there will always be things left out, and you'll have to fill in the gaps. Many of these things are pretty trivial, so if you watch an action movie, you simply assume that the characters have bodies reasonably like your own. So it makes sense that when the henchman gets shot in the chest, he falls down and dies. We assume that the henchman has a heart in his chest and that his heart is necessary for survival. But if you didn't assume that, then that wouldn't really make much sense. And of course, a fiction could change that. There's no necessary reason why they would have to have bodies like our own. But you just have to kind of make these assumptions. There's all sorts of assumptions you have to make when you watch a film, read a book, or whatever. Now, artworks also presuppose particular emotional responses. In order to comprehend the artwork properly, we have to have certain emotional responses to it. To understand why there's sad music and so on when the hero dies, this needs to be somebody we once felt some admiration for. But artworks can fail to provide the basis for such responses. Carroll gives the example of a superhero film in which the superhero is cornered by a £90 weakling. You won't feel any suspense there. The scene, in an important sense, it doesn't even make sense. A £90 weakling is no threat to a superhero. Assuming the point of the scene is to generate suspense, the scene has failed on its own terms. This would be an uncontroversial case of an aesthetic defect. If the filmmakers haven't made their villains threatening enough to generate suspense, we'd all agree that the film would be aesthetically defective for that reason. So, the next point is that many emotional responses depend on moral judgments. Feeling pity for somebody depends on the judgment that some wrong has been done to them that they don't deserve. So consider a tragedy with a morally repugnant hero. Bad things happen to this hero, and the play is clearly trying to evoke sympathy for him. But he's a horrible person. Imagine that he's a misogynist, racist, or he's a Nazi. He goes around raping and murdering people. You'd find it pretty difficult to feel sympathy for that person. Or consider humour. Somebody might make a very clever, funny joke, but this joke is at the expense of an 8-year-old child who's dying of cancer. A lot of people would feel a kind of moral disapproval of that joke that would block their ability to laugh at it. I'll give a real-life example of this, actually. My granddad has Alzheimer's, and for Christmas one year my dad bought him some special cheese. Now my granddad was very pleased with this present, and my dad said something like, "Oh, well, great, in a few days you'll have forgotten about this, so I can just get you that present every time." Now that kind of a humour is acceptable to us, but it wouldn't be for many people. If it was a friend rather than a family member who had that disease, he probably wouldn't have made that joke. So, summing up, some artworks intend for the audience to have particular emotional responses, but our ability to have certain emotional responses depends on making moral judgments. We won't feel pity for somebody we find repulsive. We won't laugh at a joke that we find morally bad. Well, some people won't anyway. It follows that if an artwork is morally defective, the audience may be unable to respond in the way intended, and the reason they're unable to respond is due to the moral defects of the work. Take the tragedy with the hero who's, some horrible rapist. The moral defect with this artwork is that it presents a rapist as somebody to admire and pity, and that's morally wrong. The aesthetic defect is that we don't feel any admiration or pity for him. What makes the work morally bad also reduces its aesthetic value. So we can formulate Carroll's argument a bit like this. Premise 1. If an artwork aims to provoke some response but the artwork fails to provoke that response, then the artwork is aesthetically defective. 2. Some responses presuppose particular moral attitudes. Pity for the tragic hero presupposes that we don't find him morally repugnant. So, if an artwork is morally defective, it may try but fail, due to its moral defects, to provoke a particular response. So, moral defects can be aesthetic defects. There's nothing unusual or exotic about this point. There are many ways an artwork might fail to provoke a response. Being morally defective is just one cause of failure among many. Also, note that this argument doesn't entail that a moral defect is always an aesthetic defect. There are cases where a moral defect doesn't get in the way of the response. So, I don't know, maybe like a stereotypical portrayal of a character that has no impact on the emotional responses the work is designed to elicit. It could just be like a really minor character who, for whatever reason, is portrayed in a racist way or something. So this argument doesn't commit Carroll to the claim of ethicism that a moral defect is always an aesthetic defect. Okay, some problems for this argument. First, we can have a reaction and feel that the reaction is morally problematic. So, it may not be true that some reactions presuppose particular moral attitudes. You watch a tragedy with an awful hero. Do your moral objections to the tragedy actually prevent you feeling pity for the hero? I find that very questionable. It seems to me that you can have emotional responses in spite of your better judgment, as it were. You can think to yourself, I really shouldn't be feeling pity for this person, but I am anyway. So, possibly then the argument is a bit problematic for that reason. Maybe reactions don't really presuppose particular moral attitudes. I think this reply doesn't really work. It ignores the fact that an important class of responses we have to artworks are meta-responses. So Susan Fagan, I think that's how you pronounce her name, drew a distinction between direct responses and meta-responses. Imagine you see a child falling off a bike. This might make you laugh. Assuming he doesn't hurt himself really badly or whatever, you might find it quite amusing. This is a direct response. But you may also experience a response to this response. You may think it was bad of you to find amusement in the child's misfortune. so you feel guilty. The guilt is a meta-response. It's a response to your direct response of amusement. So we have direct responses, and we have responses to these responses, which are meta-responses. With this distinction in mind, we can see that some responses arguably do presuppose particular moral attitudes. When you watch a tragedy, it's not just that you feel admiration and pity for the hero, you should also feel good about feeling admiration and pity for the hero. This is one of the things that tragedies are supposed to do. We're not just supposed to feel pity, we're supposed to feel good about feeling pity. Tragedy draws my attention to my own moral attitude. It lets me see that I'm sensitive. I'm the sort of person who feels pity when bad things happen to good people. And furthermore, the tragedy itself has the same sort of attitude. It's designed to elicit pity. Many other people watching the tragedy will feel pity as well. So it provokes a sense of unity and brotherhood with others. Tragedy reminds us of our common humanity, and so on. Susan Fagan thinks that these kinds of meta-responses are extremely important. To be honest, I don't think they play much of a role in my own reactions to fictions, but evidently these are among the responses a tragedy could aim to provoke. And arguably you couldn't have those feelings of unity, of common humanity. You couldn't feel good about your responses if you think that they're morally wrong. So as long as we're clear about what kinds of responses we have in mind, it seems entirely plausible to me that some responses do depend on having particular moral attitudes. Okay, second, something Carroll's argument possibly overlooks is that very often when we engage with fictions, we adopt a pretense. We will often root for the villains. We may pretend to have a different moral outlook to what we actually have. When I watch Game of Thrones, I root for the characters who are totally self-interested and who are intelligent enough and strong enough to succeed. Tywin Lannister and Peter Baelish are among my favourites. They are cunning, manipulative, intelligent and extremely dangerous. I also like Ramsay Bolton a lot as well, although he's maybe a bit too impulsive. But the point is that, granting that some responses presuppose particular moral attitudes, I can just adopt those attitudes as a pretense. I don't have to genuinely hold those attitudes. Again, this reply doesn't really work. The trouble is that it's very questionable whether we can adopt a pretense towards just anything. Suppose you're watching an erotic thriller designed to have many sexually arousing scenes, and suppose that one of these scenes produces moral revulsion because, say, it depicts rape. Well, rape is not the sort of thing you should be presenting as erotically appealing. Can you adopt a pretense and look past your moral revulsion in this case? I suspect that many people wouldn't be able to. To the extent that this scene fails to turn you on, it's aesthetically defective, and it fails to turn you on because it's morally bad. So, we can multiply examples of this as well. I mean, I've said that I often root for the villains, but even I have limits on who I can root for. Although not necessarily because they're too bad, but some villains are just idiots. I can root for Tywin Lannister, but I can't root for Joffrey. He's a moron. If an artwork required me to root for someone like Joffrey, I'm not sure I'd be able to. But the basic point here is that even if we grant the claim about adopting a pretense, there are some cases where we just can't do this. So it seems that Carroll's argument stands. Okay, the main problem with this argument. Premise 1 says that if an artwork tries but fails to provoke a particular response, then it is for that reason aesthetically defective. Premise 3 says that if an artwork is morally defective, it may try but fail to provoke a particular response. The obvious question here is, whose responses count? I mean, there are all sorts of reasons people might fail to have the response that an artwork tries to provoke. For instance, if they fall asleep for half the film, they'll probably fail to engage properly with the rest of it. But that's not necessarily the film's fault. That wouldn't be an aesthetic defect in the film. Somebody who tries to read a book in a language they have only a basic grasp of will probably not get much out of the book. Again, that's not an aesthetic defect in the book. So, for Carroll's argument to work, we need to suppose that an artwork is morally defective, is aesthetically defective, if it fails to provoke the response in an ideal audience. We have to imagine an audience of people best placed to judge the work, people who are reasonably intelligent, who understand the conventions of the genre, who are attuned to the different elements of the artwork, and so on. There are, I think, many problems with this kind of appeal, but the main one is this. If we now consider the moral case, the tragedy that presents a racist, misogynist Nazi as a hero may not have been designed to elicit sympathy from audiences like us. We could say that insofar as we're not racists, we can't take the artwork on its own terms, so we're not best placed to judge it aesthetically. The moral defects of an artwork will prevent it from provoking the right response only if we agree that they are moral defects. So the ideal audience to judge a particular artwork seems to be the audience who share the perspective of the artwork. But in that case, a moral defect won't be an aesthetic defect, because the moral defect won't prevent the ideal audience from having the right responses, since the audience shares that morally defective perspective. Now, Carroll responds to this problem by saying that that being an ideal audience involves being an ideally morally sensitive audience. And by morally sensitive audience, he means an audience with the right moral views. So, I guess for Carroll that means egalitarian, liberal, feminist, etc. views. I'm not sure about that, but I think that that Carroll is sort of on the left, on the liberal sort of side. Now, if a tragedy fails to provoke pity for the protagonist among a morally sensitive audience, it is thereby aesthetically defective. That's Carroll's proposal. The primary problem with this is that it simply begs the question. Of course, a morally sensitive audience will not be motivated by Nazi propaganda like Triumph of the Will. Of course, a morally sensitive audience will not pity the rapist who is presented as a hero in the tragedy. But why should the value of an artwork be judged against a morally sensitive audience? Why is this the audience whose opinions count? This is a good method of discerning aesthetic value only if we presuppose moralism, only if we presuppose that moral defects are aesthetic defects. But if you're an autonomist, or I think if you're just agnostic about the issue, surely you'd say that Triumph of the Will should be judged against the audience it was intended for, people attracted to Nazism. So, I don't think that argument is very persuasive. Okay, well, those are a couple of arguments for moderate moralism. Let's consider some arguments for ethicism, the view that moral defect is always an aesthetic defect and moral virtue is always an aesthetic virtue. Ethicism has been defended most forcefully by Gaut, so we'll focus on his work. First, it's worth clarifying exactly what ethicism says. There's an immediate objection we might raise to ethicism. Take a film that you like, say Point Break. Point Break is a wonderful film. The original version, anyway. I've not seen the remake. So imagine that at the beginning and end of Point Break, before the credit sequences, a bunch of statements about morality were displayed on the screen. Statements that express morally good attitudes. For instance, equality is good, Hitler was evil, and so on. This would make the film morally better. Well, here's the worry. If a moral virtue is always an aesthetic virtue, then we have to say that displaying these statements is an aesthetic virtue. In which case, it seems that we can improve the aesthetic value of any particular artwork simply by adding morally virtuous statements to it. Put them at the end of the book, at the end of the album, at the end of the film, so they don't get in the way of the rest of what's going on. Just add them there, and by doing that you'll have made an aesthetically better artwork. This is ridiculous. Most artworks would clearly be made worse if you did that. Now, what the ethicist would say to this is that something that improves aesthetic value in one respect can reduce it in another respect. And I think this is perfectly reasonable. Imagine that instead of adding these statements to the end of Point Break, we added 10 beautiful photographs of mountains. These photos have all sorts of aesthetic virtues, striking colour, sophisticated compositions, but they are totally out of place in the context of the rest of the film. Point Break would have been a worse film if it had random photos of mountains at the end, even though those photos may have had many aesthetic virtues. So, the ethicist does not claim that if an artwork is morally better, it is therefore aesthetically better overall. Making an artwork morally better may make it aesthetically worse overall. The claim is simply that if an artwork is morally better, it is in that particular respect aesthetically better. So that is important to bear in mind, that we don't sort of attribute too strong a claim to the ethicist here. Okay, now Gaut's central argument is the merited response argument. And this is quite similar to Carroll's argument. It goes like this. Some works commend certain responses to the audience, If a response is unethical, it is unmerited. In other words, we have a kind of overriding reason not to have that response. We shouldn't have that response. Premise 3. If an artwork commends an unmerited response, it is in this respect aesthetically flawed. If we have a reason, an overriding reason not to respond in the way commended by the artwork, it is in this respect aesthetically flawed. So, a moral flaw is an aesthetic flaw. A couple of comments then. So on premise 2, can responses be unethical? Well, yes, it seems they can. If you admire a white supremacist who lynches black people, we'd probably say that your response is unethical. Premise 3, a response can be unmerited for many reasons. A comedy that commends amusement but doesn't merit it, perhaps due to poor timing, is in this respect aesthetically flawed. A tragedy that commends admiration for a morally repugnant character, a tragedy that commends admiration for a character but doesn't merit it due to bad characterization or bad acting is aesthetically flawed. Similarly, a tragedy that commends admiration for a character but doesn't merit it due to moral flaws is aesthetically flawed. The tragedy commends that we admire the racist, misogynist Nazi, but this would be morally wrong, and its being morally wrong provides a sort of overriding reason not to have that response. The response of admiration is unmerited. And notice, incidentally, that an exactly parallel argument leads to the conclusion that moral virtues are aesthetic virtues. If a response is ethical, it is in that respect merited. If an artwork commends a merited response, it is in that respect aesthetically good. So, a moral virtue is an aesthetic virtue. Now, although this argument is similar to Carroll's argument, it does kind of make a stronger claim. Carroll's argument suggests that artworks can fail on their own terms in virtue of moral defects. So the artwork commends a response, but we don't feel the response due to its moral repugnance. On Gaut's argument, we may have the response or we may not. It doesn't matter. The moral repugnance of the response commended by the work counts as an aesthetic defect, whether or not we actually have the response. So notice that one of the main benefits of Gaut's argument is that he doesn't need to appeal to ideal audiences or anything like that. All that matters for Gaut's argument is that the artwork commends an immoral response. It's irrelevant whether or not anybody has the response. Okay, so in some ways this is a stronger argument than Carroll's, but there is still a big problem with it. And the problem is this. If a response is immoral, it will evidently be unmerited in some sense. But is it unmerited in a way that is relevant to aesthetic evaluation? Recall one of the points I made in the first video, I think, in the introduction, that jokes can be funny precisely because they're immoral. Can't there be aesthetically merited responses that are morally unmerited? Daniel Jacobson takes this line in a bit more detail. He says, look, there are various senses in which we might say a response is unmerited. In one sense, we can say that a response is unmerited because it presupposes that the object or event to which it is directed has properties it doesn't actually have. Consider envy. I might envy a person's life, and this presupposes that his life is better than mine in certain relevant respects. Perhaps I assume that he's happier or richer or whatever. If I'm wrong about this, and his life isn't better than mine, then my envy is unmerited. Jacobson says that when an emotion is unmerited in this sense, it is unwarranted. His life does not warrant my envy because it doesn't have the properties that I presuppose it has. On the other hand, suppose that his life really is better than mine, so my envy is warranted. We still may say that the envy is unmerited for other reasons. We might say that envy is pointless. It's better to focus on improving yourself rather than getting hung up about the fact that some people have it better than you. Or we might think that envy is myopic in a certain sense, bearing in mind that millions of people in the world are literally starving. Perhaps there's something base and vicious in wanting to trade your perfectly comfortable existence for a slightly more comfortable existence. Another example is anger. Suppose you've devoted yourself to Zen Buddhism and you spend your time meditating and trying to overcome negative emotions. One day you're wronged by someone. They defraud you out of a large amount of money. Their action clearly warrants anger. Their action was unjust and you're the victim. But if you're committed to Zen Buddhism, you'll have very good reasons not to become angry at this. Part of what that religion involves is becoming accepting of all events, even bad ones. So, what all this suggests is that whether or not a response is unwarranted depends on the properties of the event that the response is directed at, but it may be unmerited for other reasons, and there are many such reasons. It could be imprudent. There are some people, like your boss at work, who it's a bad idea to get angry with even if their behaviour warrants it. Or it may be unmerited because it's immoral. Envy is perhaps an example of this, or finding amusement in a racist joke, or admiring and pitying a repugnant hero in a tragedy. So with this distinction in mind, let's reconsider the merited response argument. Here it is. What does the word unmerited mean in this argument? Well, if it means unwarranted, then it looks like premise 3 here is probably okay. Remember, to say that a response is unwarranted is to say that the response presupposes that the object or event to which it's directed has properties it doesn't really have. We can imagine an artwork trying to get us to feel fear, but where there's nothing scary about the thing we're being asked to be afraid of, like the superhero versus the £90 weakling. So, premise 3 arguably works. If an artwork commends an unwarranted response, it is in this respect aesthetically flawed. But now premise 2 is just wrong. The fact that a response is unethical doesn't mean it's unwarranted. Envying a person whose life is better than yours may be morally questionable, but given the nature of envy, it's totally warranted. On the other hand, suppose we interpret unmerited to mean ethically unmerited. Well, then premise 2 is fine, it's trivially true. But premise 3 just begs the question. You'll only accept the premise, if an artwork commends an ethically unmerited response, it is in this respect aesthetically flawed, if you already accept ethicism. So the merited response argument fails, and that, broadly speaking, is Daniel Jacobson's objection. I think it's a reasonably persuasive objection. A second argument from Gaut is the moral beauty argument. This is essentially just the straightforward claim that moral value has, in general, aesthetic value. The morally virtuous is, in general, aesthetically beautiful, and the morally bad is, in general, aesthetically ugly. So the fact that the moral value of artworks affects their aesthetic value is just one instance of this. Now, in defence of this claim, Gaut points out that we often describe people as being beautiful or ugly in terms of their character or personality or attitudes, and these are clearly moral judgments. Now, it seems that if people are good morally, then they become aesthetically more beautiful. And there's a long tradition of this kind of language, of talk of beauties of the soul, or to put it in more modern terms, beauties of the mind. It's just like how we can aesthetically evaluate a person's wit, a person's sense of humour. I think it's plausible to say that a person who has a good sense of humour, who's fun to be around, is in that respect more aesthetically appealing than somebody who's boring and antisocial. So there's more to beauty than just how a person looks. Marcia Eaton gives an interesting analogy on this point. Imagine you see a beautiful plant. Its stem and petioles have lovely, graceful curves. Its leaves have unusual shapes and striking colours. But then you learn that this plant is in fact a very destructive weed. It's a non-native species that has caused severe ecological problems in the area. Would this affect our judgment of how beautiful it is? I mean, it still looks very beautiful. Its surface properties are just as beautiful. But for many people, when they learn more about this plant, about how destructive it is, that would reduce their aesthetic appreciation of it. So the moral beauty argument suggests that even outside of art, moral value is already a kind of aesthetic value. Insofar as we make moral judgments, we also make aesthetic judgments. Now, an obvious difficulty with this argument, as Gaut points out, isn't talk of moral beauty and moral ugliness just metaphorical. If I find a person's behaviour morally bad, I can say, your behaviour stinks. But this doesn't mean that morally bad things literally smell bad. I can say that somebody's attitude towards suffering is cold, in the sense that they don't evince appropriate emotions. It doesn't mean that their attitude literally has a low temperature. Humans naturally make association between different things. We see similarities and use metaphors. So just because we talk about things being morally beautiful or morally ugly, it doesn't mean we're literally attributing aesthetic value to morality. Now, I think the moral beauty argument is somewhat stronger than this criticism suggests. I think there are good reasons to take talk of moral beauty and moral ugliness literally. An important point that Gaut notes is that generally we say that a word is used metaphorically when interpreting it literally would lead to absurdities. Your attitude is cold, taken literally, is obvious nonsense. It's a category error. Attitudes don't have temperatures. Or suppose that my friend has been dumped by his girlfriend. He feels upset, and to cheer him up I say, well, there's plenty more fish in the sea. That's true, but totally irrelevant. What does the amount of fish have to do with my friend's predicament, right? Well, nothing like this seems to be the case for talk of moral beauty and moral ugliness. It doesn't seem like there's any problem, any kind of obvious absurdity in taking it literally. And second, note that there are many, many kinds of beauty. There's the beauty of physical appearance, a sexy woman or a striking mountain range, but there are also more abstract kind of beauties. Scientists and mathematicians will often speak of the beauty of particular physical laws, or the beauty of mathematical theorems, or of particular numbers. Some people find the number pi beautiful. Indeed, there are even some scientists who seem to take aesthetic considerations into their weighing of theories. They may support a theory simply because they find it more elegant than the others. Whether that's an acceptable criterion of theory choice is certainly open to question, but it shows that we can think of purely abstract things as being more or less beautiful. So why shouldn't moral value be beautiful? So I think we can defeat this first objection. Unfortunately, there are a couple of other objections which are rather more damaging. Second, the division between moral virtues and moral vices arguably does not match the division between the morally beautiful and morally ugly. We often admire vices and find them compelling in various ways, whereas moral virtues are often simply boring. Susan Wolfe has an article called Moral Saints, which is well worth reading. A moral saint is a person who has no vices, whose every action is as morally good as it can be. Now, Wolfe asks, would it be a good thing for a person to be morally perfect, to be a moral saint? Is this... It would be good morally, of course, but is this good as a kind of personal ideal? Would we want ourselves or our friends to be moral saints? When we start to think about what's actually involved in moral sainthood, arguably no. The moral saint will spend all her time working for various charities. She'll never insult people, never be rude or sarcastic. She'll have very few possessions of her own. She'll never pursue any projects of her own because she spends all her time helping others. The moral saint could never become an exceptionally skilled guitarist, for instance. She could never have enough interest in philosophy to watch this video, for instance. You're not a moral saint if you're watching this video instead of working for charity. So this is a person who would be dull, boring, she'd have no personality. Now consider the people you admire. A lot of people admire rock stars like Lemmy, David Bowie, Mick Jagger. Rock stars are not moral saints, and very often their vices are what make them so appealing. We all prefer people to have some vices. So arguably then, this idea that the moral virtues and moral vices divide neatly into the morally beautiful and morally ugly is very much open to question. The third problem is similar to the second, but I think perhaps more damaging. Let's grant that moral virtues are always aesthetically beautiful, and moral vices are always aesthetically ugly. The problem now is that the division between the aesthetically good and aesthetically bad does not match the division between the aesthetically beautiful and aesthetically ugly. Ugliness is not necessarily an aesthetic defect. In fact, it can improve aesthetic value as a whole. In the context of environmental aesthetics, a famous example is hiking through an especially beautiful area, and you come across the carcass of an elk filled with maggots. This is really ugly. It's repulsive. You wouldn't want to take a photo of this and put the photo on the wall of your house to admire. And yet we may feel that these ugly parts of nature enrich the experience of the hike overall. We might feel that our experience would have been lesser in some way if we'd only had the scenic and the beautiful parts. Now, there are two ways really of putting this point. First, we can say that ugliness can become beautiful in the right context. So when you consider the context of the ecosystem as a whole, the cycles of life and death, you can see that the rotting carcass has a beauty of its own. Death is an essential part of the ecosystem. just as much as the beautiful clear rivers and the majestic redwood trees are. Now, I find this approach implausible in its own right, and in any case it doesn't really work as a response to the moral beauty argument, because Gaut could grant, in fact he should grant, that the morally bad can become morally good or at least be morally acceptable in the right context. So a satire, for instance, will present a bad outlook in a critical context. There's obviously nothing morally defective about that. American Psycho, for instance, isn't morally defective because it presents a highly sort of materialistic attitude in a satirical context. So if we take this approach, I don't think this would really threaten Gaut's argument, because he could just say, well, as long as we put morally bad attitudes in the right context, then they're okay. But now this is what the second approach, which is, I think, damaging to Gaut's argument, and this is the approach I find much more plausible, is just to say that aesthetic ugliness just in itself is not necessarily an aesthetic defect. So we can grant that the rotting carcass is ugly, and even if we know everything there is to know about biology and ecology, we still find it ugly. We can't help but be repulsed by rotting carcasses. So in no sense does it sort of become beautiful. But this doesn't mean that rotting carcasses are aesthetically defective. They may still help to enrich the aesthetic experience. I think this pretty seriously undermines the moral beauty argument. We can grant that the morally good is aesthetically beautiful and the morally bad is aesthetically ugly, but it simply doesn't follow from this that the morally bad is an aesthetic defect, because aesthetic ugliness is not necessarily an aesthetic defect. To just drive this point home, here are a few paintings and drawings. It seems to me that all of these images are aesthetically ugly. In these cases, it's not even that the context makes them less ugly, because these are the whole artworks. So, what context are you putting them in that makes them less ugly? These are the complete things. Nevertheless, they are still aesthetically brilliant. So, to sum up these 2 points, the last two points, Gaut wants to show that a moral virtue is an aesthetic virtue and a moral defect is an aesthetic defect. But he assumes, first of all, that the morally virtuous and morally vicious exactly tracks the morally beautiful and the morally ugly. That is questionable. And he assumes, second, that the beautiful, the aesthetically beautiful and the aesthetically ugly exactly tracks the aesthetically good and the aesthetically bad. Both of these assumptions are questionable. In fact, the second should definitely be rejected in my view. As these sorts of images illustrate, ugly things can be aesthetically brilliant. This image is Saturn devouring his son by Goya. I don't think there's anything beautiful about this. I mean, what are we going to say? Maybe, I don't know, the depiction of the... Maybe there's some grace in how the body is depicted or something, but even that, I don't think it is. If you look at that picture, even kind of close up, even like the brush strokes are really just thick and ugly. It's not a beautiful image. So ultimately, I think there is something plausible in the basic idea that moral value is already a kind of aesthetic value. We can say that a person's character is beautiful or ugly. And I think this can be taken literally, it seems a reasonable way of speaking. But the stronger conclusion that moral virtues are always aesthetic virtues and moral defects are always aesthetic defects simply doesn't follow. So that was a short introduction to moralism. I hope it was helpful. In the next video we'll look at variablism, but that's all for now. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.